The rescue team was utterly perplexed. They could not make any sense of the grisly scene before them. How had these 5 hikers met their demise? And where were the remaining 4 bodies? It was February 1959, in an icy mountain pass near Siberia. 9 hikers had recently gone missing in that remote area, and the rescuers arrived to discover 5 corpses scattered about, some burned, some nearly naked. Disturbingly, one had human flesh in his mouth. There was no apparent cause of death, and all 9 hikers were highly experienced. So, why had they abandoned their tent and fled half-dressed into the forest? Had there been some kind of accident? Or were they attacked? No one knew, and for 6 decades, those unanswered questions sparked intense debate and dark conspiracy theories among the local population, the Russian equivalent of the Roswell incident. However, last year scientists finally determined what had transpired on that snowy mountain pass. It's a bizarre tale involving cadavers and a Disney film. But at long last, the mystery of those burned, naked and deceased bodies in the Siberian wilderness has been solved. In 1959, a 23-year-old Russian engineering student named Igor Dyatlov organized an expedition for himself and 8 university friends. Their goal was to scale a peak in the remote Ural Mountains. The team ranged in age from 20 to 24 and included 2 women. The Soviet government also assigned a 38-year-old chaperone, bringing the total to 10 people. They were all experienced skiers and winter campers. In fact, they were remarkably hardy. On a previous trip, one of them had been accidentally shot by a hunter's shotgun, yet she simply skied 50 miles to the nearest clinic without fuss. This toughness would prove necessary, as they planned to venture into the Ural Mountains in February, the harshest time of year there. Despite the danger, the hikers had a jolly time on the train journey out, hiding under the seats to avoid paying fares. One even brought a mandolin, strumming it to pass the time. And after the train, they took various buses, trucks, and horse-drawn sleighs to reach a frontier village. At this point, one hiker dropped out due to knee pain and never saw his companions alive again. The trek began on January 28th. It would be a 215-mile round trip. The landscape was mostly rolling forests of birch, fir and cedar, with snow piled up to 5 feet deep in places. Winds reached 60 meters. On February 1st, the team attempted to cross a treeless pass between 2 mountains. One was called Kholat Syakhl, or Dead Mountain. This should have been an easy ski, but a blizzard struck and disoriented them. Instead of passing through the gap, they ended up climbing the lower slopes of Dead Mountain. As darkness fell, they realized their mistake. At this point, Igor Dyatlov decided not to retreat down the mountain to the sheltering forest below. His team had already ascended quite high, and he didn't want to lose that elevation the next day. Instead, they would camp on the exposed slopes of Dead Mountain. To shield themselves from the wind, the hikers dug a 4-foot deep hole in the snow and set up their tent inside it. They then settled down to eat and sleep, with some even writing in their journals, unaware that these would be their final records. The hikers were expected back home on February 12th, but delays were common in long hikes, so no one worried when they didn't return on that date. However, as the days passed, the 13th, the 14th, and then the 15th, their friends and family started to grow concerned. By the 16th, local authorities had launched a rescue mission. On February 25th, the rescue team found the partially snow-covered tent with gashes in its walls, leading them to suspect foul play. They followed some unusual footprints leading away from the tent, including some bare footprints. A mile away, they discovered the remains of a fire and 2 bodies, one being the mandolin player, both wearing only underwear and with signs of severe burns. Further searching uncovered 3 more bodies, including that of Igor Dyatlov, all of whom had been trying to make their way back to the tent but had succumbed to the blizzard. Despite extensive efforts, the rescuers could not locate the remaining 4 hikers. Upon examining the tent, a seamstress visiting the police station determined that the gashes were not the result of an attack, but rather the hikers had slashed their way out of the tent. Autopsies confirmed that all 5 had died from hypothermia. Months later, a hunter stumbled upon a strange pit, where the missing 4 bodies were eventually found. These victims, however, had suffered much more severe injuries, including cracked ribs, fractured skulls, and the removal of their facial features. 2 of them were even wearing the clothes of their deceased companions. The circumstances surrounding the Dyatlov Pass incident remained highly perplexing, with the authorities unable to determine the exact sequence of events that led to the hikers' tragic demise. At the time, for an unknown reason, Soviet party officials abruptly intervened and shut down the investigation. They claimed that an avalanche had killed the group and then confiscated all related documents. However, this avalanche explanation did not seem plausible to the public. Hunters living near Dead Mountain had never witnessed an avalanche in that area. Additionally, avalanches typically leave behind obvious signs, such as large amounts of displaced snow, but the rescue team found no such evidence when they arrived. There were other inconsistencies as well. Avalanches require slopes steeper than 30 degrees, but the slope where the hikers were camped was gentler than that. Furthermore, avalanche victims usually die from asphyxiation, not blunt force trauma, yet the 4 buried victims had suffered blunt force injuries. Given these anomalies, the avalanche theory appeared dubious. The more Soviet officials insisted on it, the more people suspected a cover-up. But what were they trying to conceal? With little concrete evidence, various conspiracy theories started to emerge, ranging from Yetis to CIA plots. This might have remained a tangled web of unproven speculations, if not for the efforts of 2 determined Swiss scientists, Alexander Puzrin and Johann Gaum. Puzrin, a geological engineer, became obsessed with the case and recruited Gaum, an avalanche simulation expert, to help investigate. Upon closer examination, the scientist realized the avalanche theory was more plausible than commonly believed. While the overall slope was gentler than 30 degrees, the ground was actually quite uneven, with steeper sections that met the required angle. Additionally, the hikers had dug into the snow, exposing a layer of weak, rotten ice beneath. This unstable setup made the snow prone to a slab avalanche, where a single hard slab of snow could suddenly slide off the weak ice layer. The Swiss scientists began to suspect that a slab avalanche had struck the hikers, so they tried modeling a similar event on a computer, but found the physics of snow to be surprisingly complex. Fortunately, one of the scientists, Gaun, had recently watched the Disney movie Frozen and was impressed by the realistic-looking snow effects. He reached out to the film's animators, who agreed to share the code they had used. With this code, the scientists were able to run simulations that supported the slab avalanche theory. They proposed that the hikers, in digging out their camp, had disturbed the slab of snow over the rotten ice. When this slab eventually shifted, it buried the hikers under a crushing weight of snow. This explained why the hikers had cut their way out of the tent and why some had fled without boots or coats. They were likely struggling just to free themselves. However, the slab avalanche theory did not fully account for the blunt force injuries suffered by some of the hikers. To investigate this, the scientists looked into macabre experiments from the 1970s, where car manufacturers had slammed weights into cadavers to study car accident injuries. They noticed that the cadavers propped against rigid backgrounds had sustained worse injuries. This gave them a clue. What if the hikers' shelter had collapsed on them, with several tons of snow slamming into the branches they had laid as a floor? The final piece of the puzzle was the lack of previous avalanche sightings on Dead Mountain. To investigate this, the scientists hired guides and visited the site, where they were able to capture footage of the type of small, wind-covered slab avalanche they had predicted. Putting it all together, the scientists theorized that the lost hikers had dug their camp below a hidden 30-degree slope with rotten ice underneath. This slab of snow eventually released, crushing their tent. The survivors escaped, but some suffered blunt force injuries when their hastily built shelter collapsed under the weight of the snow. Unfortunately, the fire did little to help the hikers. Two of them, desperately trying to stay warm, leaned dangerously close to the flames, scorching their skin. Tragically, they ultimately succumbed to hypothermia. As for why these two were found nearly undressed, it's possible their companions removed their clothing in an effort to protect themselves. Alternatively, those freezing to death can experience a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, where their minds become delusional and they believe they are overheating, leading them to strip off their clothes. This delusional state may also explain why one hiker resorted to biting off part of his own hand. Meanwhile, 3 other hikers set out to retrieve their buried tent and gear but became separated in the dark blizzard, and each perished alone. The remaining 4 hikers managed to dig a snow pit for shelter, lining it with pine branches. However, their poor luck continued when they unknowingly dug over a stream that had hollowed out an ice tunnel below. This tunnel collapsed, crushing the hikers against the branches and causing fatal injuries to their heads and chests. As for the missing facial features, this was likely due to the bodies lying face down in the stream, with tissue either rotting away or small animals scavenging before the rescue team arrived months later. Experts believe the hikers' expertise ultimately led to their demise. Fearing a second, larger avalanche after the initial slab avalanche, they rushed downhill, a textbook response. But ironically, if they had been less experienced and simply stayed put, they may have been able to dig out their tent and survive. While some maintain conspiracy theories involving Yetis or the CIA, most experts agree that the research of Puzrin and Gaum has finally provided the victims' families with answers and closed the books on this strange and tragic adventure.